fact that I like to think about why things are organised the way they are, why they're arranged the way they are, perhaps makes me a sucker for being approached and asked if I'd like to organise an exhibition, because an exhibition, in a way, is a kind of rehearsal of politics and sentiments and values and aesthetics and sheer dumb physical space, which, you know, is a fact of everyone's life. You know, you take up X amount of room and you're meant to share it with other people. People just die for a theme, you know. They are... I've never encountered such pressure, you know. If a bus goes past, what theme is that, you know? And if you meet a tree, what kind of theme is that? OK, you name them, we can say. They're not the same thing. So I suppose one of my expectations for the exhibition was that if people are so able to converse with each other, which is a kind of trading agreement, really. It's a kind of act of... You recognise things in another person, you see what kind of... whether they're responsive to what you say, whether they look bored. And each of you, or all of you, contributes to that. And if we can do that between each other, then I know for sure we do that with the world of what we all leave behind, you know, the stuff of the world. So why shouldn't one make an exhibition which, in fact, invites that sort of navigation? Why shouldn't one offer people the opportunity of sailing through something? What I suppose I mean by that is that the show has a very high conversational element or sensibility or proposal. I mean, I think it's very true of what it's like to work things out. You know the space in there with all the bases in it? And then there's a funny little dog-leg space, a bit of a... not a rather difficult space. If you could put the Great Bear in there so you can see it from the street. And the other thing that you should feel free to do is that if you find yourselves having, you know, critical thoughts, tell me what they are, you know. I may not agree with you, but it helps, you know, because you're punters and you haven't seen the stuff before. So if that can go round into that there, so you could see it from the street. Oh, I mean, imagine the energy, Roger, to make a bloody brick, all that. It's fantastic. It's absurd.
Who's presented them like this?
Well, that's the usual thing, isn't it? That they've over-presented them.
Who's they?
Baggeridge Bricks. Oh, I think this is good. I wish they hadn't painted it. It's so typical, isn't it?
That would be very good. That would be very... Very near where I live, there's this house clearance place, and it fluctuates from really very... they're not elegant, but they're eloquent and sort of semi-logical arrangements of all our worlds, all this stuff that we live with. That's when they're displaying it. Then they go home, and there's a percentage every day which is kind of... They either just get, you know, the back hurts and they can't be bothered to move it, or it's clearly never going to sell, and it's dumped. Go down to get the papers in the morning, and I meet a sort of domestic disaster. Everything that's sort of semi-familiar, nothing that I would particularly wish to live with, but it doesn't... that's not the point. And it's quite obvious that it's what conventionally you call... it's the trash. It's on its way out. It's had it. No one wants it. So I did I was a very deliberate tourist of it. It is only a version of archaeology. It's all archaeologists do when they dig stuff up. This just happens to be now. This is a kind of exhibition. This is a kind of, hello world, this is what you do.
Just looking at the tin head there too, and sort of working which of the key spaces need pinning in some way, because you do have this sort of great run back from them. And this one I think is it's sometimes nice. I mean, when I think of things that have worked on here, that kind of beckon people in through from it, and actually being able to catch a glimpse of something, because the sight lines are actually fairly lengthy on looking at what's happening.
Well, we might end up dealing with that in this way, because we've got the shelf ones as well. So we might, get it into some sort of dense, objecty, one that you have to go up to because you can't see it until you get up to it. Michael seems to think that we can calm lots of different areas. He doesn't seem to think that they all have to be... He's extremely strong that this wall should have a controlling image on it. Rather than my thought would be to try Gursky there. Right. I mean, you can only go with a first feeling. Sure. I would hate to end up with a sort of bourgeois hallway of little prints. I think I meant to go and talk to the radio. There's no suggestion that any of these objects are what we call art. They are nonetheless in a space which is slightly magnetic, has some kind of pull, has some kind of attraction, things to which if you found any of these blowing around in the street, you'd pay some attention to them, because they're somehow full of intention and certain kinds of quality, and what's more, they've all lived. They've all done a job, they've all belonged to somebody for a while. They may now have entered that strange limbo of nobodies, and maybe that's the sort of tragedy of what a museum is that you can't re-obtain it in an original private space. You can only... you're forced back into a kind of generalised moment. The block of wood's drilled with 2 holes right through it, and through the 2 holes are 2 sticks. So it's possible to raise the block up, and then you can see once it goes up to a certain height, it can go no further because there's a piece of wood on the top, and that leaves a space underneath of about, well, sort of mouse-sized space, I suppose, about 2.5 inches. In fact, you could get the whole family in there. And the mechanism is very simple. The mouse goes under the wooden block, and the mouse, if it disturbs this little piece of wood, a bit of wood falls out, string goes away, and this is in slow motion, and then the block falls and supposedly crushes the mouse. It seems to me that this is an idea about killing mice. It could be the prototype that didn't make it. We have a lot of patents in the exhibition. Maybe this is the one that didn't sort of make $1 million for the mousetrap manufacturer. One of the sort of pleasures of the show is not knowing what in the hell I'm going to do with any of it. It's Tuesday, and by Friday we have to make finite decisions. In fact, by Wednesday we have to make finite decisions, and by Friday it has to be up. But there's something about the terror of seeing these pieces of the world in a box, and a sense of obligation that I better find a way of making them manifest, that is probably energising in some ways. And interestingly, it's the artists who, so far, have been the most conservative. It's the artists who ring up and say, you will make sure it's at the right height on the wall and, 4¼ inches from the window. I hope everyone can just bear with this process. I mean, there will be a moment when we'll drill a hole, I promise. Sorry. Right, well, this is... well, you can tell what it is because it's a cardboard box, and on the outside of the cardboard box is written the word Dyson. And, of course, it's completely logical for this show that some aspect of his project should be visible, because you don't do what he's done without, as it were, thinking aloud. And what we've got here is a Hoover Junior, and it is actually the Hoover Junior that irritated him so much when he came home and found that it didn't work. So he attacked it, but of course through various aspects of publicity, what we know is that this was done in fury. You know, this was done in kind of, I'll bloody well make this thing work properly. And in a funny sort of way, I think that it's a very charged object, because none of us really, we probably no longer choose what is mythic and what is not, because we live in this gale of mediation. So, you know, it's impossible not to know who Princess Di is or was. And by the same token, it's quite difficult for, let's say, 50% of the country not to know that there's a Hoover called a Dyson, or a Dyson which is a Hoover. And in fact, somebody told me the other day that you could tell that it had arrived because they said, "Shall I put the Dyson away in the Hoover cupboard?" And I thought that was a very nice, twisty moment. Anyway, the reason I think it's a sort of a very dignified object for the exhibition, it's not really about design. It's got nothing to do with styling. It's purely somebody trying to work out how to make something work. And in that sense, it contains some of the energy that you can see in a decent painting or a good film or all sorts of things which are made for very different reasons. They're not meant to be serviceable in a kind of, you know, they're not meant to clean your carpets. They're maybe meant to clean your mind. Walk around this exhibition with a child, and the child will tell you very quickly where value lies, where fantasy lies, where belief is. And you would never say to a child, you know, "Don't be so stupid, it's a lump of plastic. Of course it's not a dinosaur." You nourish the possibility that if they want to enter a lump of plastic, which is sort of vaguely in a dinosaur configuration, but, you know, 1/1,000,000th the size, you let them run with it. You don't let them, you probably even provoke it. She left the Slade last summer, and it's a sort of history of her granny. I mean, there's a photograph of her granny that goes with it, who was born in 1914 and is still alive in 1998. And I mean, it's a difficult thing to talk about because it's a mixture of world history and incredibly naive, ordinary intimacies, mixed up with the fact that her English isn't very good. So Pearl Harbor is Peel Harbor. You know, as you end up feeling incredibly sympathetic towards this woman who's had a wretched life. And, you know, people have been dying on her all over the place, and she's been effectively through a couple of wars. But it's all on the, you know, the other way around. Actually, I've just seen another spelling mistake, which is quite amazing. 1978. Wood's first test tube baby was born. That's W-O-U-L-D. And it's, I mean, I think it's really cheap to laugh, but the fact that it's become text means that you can't not see it.
What will let you get the war? To lift it.
What?
Screws in there.
Oh, really?
Stand it up.
The only thing is, God, what a thing.
makes you realise what slobs we all are when you see that sort of engineering. I wonder actually if it won't have more presence if we just left it on the palette and clipped its wings. Take off its
Well, we can take it up there on the pallet truck.
Can you do that?
Yeah, yeah.
If we could just do a little bit of look and see.
I mean, I think that's what's interesting about it. It's not, I don't think making the White Cliffs of Dover is particularly interesting, but I think going to Rome to make it is really odd.
You'll have to get your lady on the desk to tell everybody.
And I think the question of it being a bit of a model, too, you almost expect sort of... Was it Goebbels or Goering who was a sort of train freak? You know, you expect a little train to run out of the end of it. I mean, it's in that space that a lot of people are interested in now, which is sort of not sculpture but model, you know, sort of... I mean, my criticism of the Gursky at the moment is that it's behaving like the Tim Head, that they're both operating as altarpieces.
Yeah, yeah.
And I think Tim's is doing that, and it's doing it well, and you can see it from the street.
Yeah.
And it's kind of gothic and a bit hot. I think before we go tonight, we must have a sort of vitrine killing session. You know, where we'll just... I don't want to come into the forest tomorrow. I just want to come into a sort of spatial...
Yeah. Well, we're keeping them wrapped until we're getting...
Oh, no, I think we should keep them wrapped.
Yeah.
I don't... just what I mean is that they should stop being a zoo. It's an invitation, and in that sense, it's no different than inviting people to dinner. You know, you lay the table, and it's an optimistic act. You don't... You know, people come, they sit down, they drink, they eat. They may loathe each other and go home hating the fact that they were even asked. But at least you know what the project is, and you enter the project because you accept the invitation. And I think it is an exhibition which invites you to take it how you want to take it. But the show will constantly tease you. It will argue with various... It argues with me, and heavens, I made the show. My temperature goes up and down when I'm in it. Someone will have to put air in that every day. The way that Gaspard Marin came to be in this show is not so very different from the way that all the other things came about, which is that they've come out of conversation, they've come out of Leeds. So there was a tip-off that there was this anarchist anthropologist called Gaspard Marin, who was Belgian, and he lived in a commune in Gloucestershire for most of his life. He was somebody who couldn't stop observing, making typologies. He must have written thousands of words every day. Most of the words he wrote were in Esperanto. And I suppose the easiest way to say it is that he was an insistent codifier. The sort of person that, should he ever get into government, you would be horrified by. what makes him wonderful is that he didn't get into government, because in a way that's precisely what he shunned. And that, in another way, is what makes him very like artists. So he had an extraordinarily productive life, but essentially a secret one. And the thing that's extraordinary about it is that it's completely inaccessible. It's the kind of thing that's captivating to look at. You couldn't possibly pass by here without being made inquisitive, but it's hard to say what you would do with the results of your inquisitiveness. You could press on this with all your curiosity, and you're not going to take very much out of it that you could quantify. But in another way, you can feel that this is intensely human. You can feel that this is a cousin of all dowry making, all reportage, and in some way you could say that it was like all gazing. And Marat somehow stands for that, and that why he's special in the exhibition is that he probably never thought of himself as an artist. It's hard for me to say whether he is an artist, but he's incredibly like an artist. So Marat, as it turns out, as luck would have it, has turned out to be pretty well central to the show. Not quite midway, but midway enough. And you can, I think, even by the time you arrive at Marat, you already kind of go, hey, you know, these are some pretty bizarre crossovers, connections, disconnections. Even something as cheap as Marcel Brothez, who he would never have known, but was a very brilliant Belgian artist. Different generations, they're both dead. It seems rather nice that in a show that you can bring two people together and say, oh, you should have met, you'd have enjoyed each other. And for sure, Brothez, who was extremely involved in the idea of the museum and the insistence of how museums tell you how to see the world and come with this authoritative template of looking, understanding, organising, reading. Brothez would have adored this material. Okay. Well, it's interesting that this is the most difficult space we've had to deal with. And it's ironic, isn't it, that it's a space which, if you had to play a kind of party game and say, well, what does this space remind you of? It wouldn't be long before you'd say a chapel or something even with perhaps an element, perhaps the private chapel or even the school hall of the very small school, but a kind of dignified and ennobling space. Well, there are a lot of things in this exhibition which are anti-heroic, which seems to me to be a reasonable thing for artists to be involved in by the end of the 20th century. And this is the first time I've started to realise that we've probably made the show work properly. And by properly, I mean not that it's neat and tidy, but that it's kind of argumentative in some way. So that, you know, we have a kind of inverted altarpiece to the pleasures of British retailing in the 1980s and 1990s. But we also have things which operate as a complete foil to that, like the Frank Gehry model for a building which is not yet built, but I'm sure it will be. You can travel with a backpack or a little suitcase, and you can move house, and they're not the same thing. So the Kettles Yard version is a little bit like arriving in the pre-booked hotel room, and you open the suitcase, and maybe you don't even quite unpack, you just accept that it's a compressed experience. And I think it works incredibly well, but it's very, very dense, and there isn't any more space. The one thing that Kettles Yard has that nobody else has is the implication of the street. So in fact the exhibition is extremely permeable, and that's, for me, is thrilling. I mean, to see people cross the road and press up against the glass, and you can even see them rehearsing what it is that they're seeing, and they talk to each other, I think is very exciting. And that's not going to happen in Camden. Camden is almost a sort of Edwardian palazzo. You know, it's on one level, and it's got generous spaces, and it's got a sense of being public, and it's 100 years old, and it's optimistic. Was a very optimistic building. So the sort of thing I can do in Camden is I can concentrate things, I can play with the space much more, I can have distant viewings of things, I can have intense corners and cooler spaces. And I'm going to get a red carpet for Camden so that you can't enter the show without being an exhibit. The very nature of walking on a red carpet is that you already got some cred. And I think that's a nice thing to do. You know, it's a perfect space to do it. It's got steps, and it's got a kind of, hello, I'm Camden. It's not that democratic thing which, you know, Kettles Yard is kind of modernist democratic, you know, come all ye faithful. I think this exhibition is quite busy saying, well, we might be tribally a little bit different, but how different? You know, what is it really that makes this so different? Isn't it aren't we really all, you know, implicated in each other in a kind of infinity?